Mic test. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second part of our Chapter 4 lecture. As a reminder, we ended our first part talking about prominent research in the SSP phase of sociological social psychology. And as a reminder, studies within an SSP framework are often categorized by the context or setting they focus on. Most contemporary work focuses on the effects of social stratification on psychology and behavior, so it's focusing on the components element of SSP. The social context, the proximate environments people are in that have received the most attention are workplace, school, and the family. So while proximate context isn't always the focus of SSP research, or even often when it is, it's normally focused in the context of workplace, schools, and family. And then finally, many analyses examine multiple institutions at once, often highlighting their interrelationship, e.g., work and family, family and education. So with that framing out of the way, let's jump right into it, shall we? So first thing, SSP and work. This is research done by Cohn, not to be confused with Kuhn, Cohn and Schooler. So Cohn and Schooler demonstrated that work conditions explain class differences in personality. So there we see class differences as the components element. They're focusing on proximate conditions, work conditions, and they're focusing on how that impacts individuals' personality at the micro level. So, what was involved in this study? What did they find? They found that jobs vary in their level of occupational self direction. So, these various work contexts differ in terms of the degree of self direction that individuals are exposed to, and this in turn impacts their personality. And you can make the argument very easily that the class that you're born in likely determines or has a major determining effect on the occupation that you're in. The occupation has variations in terms of self direction, and this in turn impacts your personality. So what did they find specifically? They found that white-collar professional jobs involve high levels of occupational self-direction in that they are complex, involve little supervision, and give individuals substantial latitude in terms of how and when work is done. So, for example, being a professor is a white-collar professional job. I'm given a lot of latitude in deciding the best way to go ahead and engage in complex instruction and activities with relatively little direct oversight. That doesn't mean there's no oversight, but I don't have a manager standing behind me making sure that when I'm on the clock, I'm on the clock and I'm not going to use the bathroom and such. This is compared with things like manual labor and other working class jobs, which are characterized by low occupational self direction. The work is routine, closely monitored, and individuals have few opportunities for independent decision making. If you're like my dad, who worked in a factory that was making paper and plastic bags, he couldn't go to the bathroom whenever he wanted because he had a supervisor closely monitoring him. The work he did was routine. He had to do the same set of tasks day in and day out, and there was very little opportunity for him to innovate on the tasks he was given. He was expected to do the task that he was given as he was directed to do it. So why does this matter in terms of its connection to social psychology? We find that occupational self-direction leads to a self-directed orientation, i.e., a sense of personal responsibility, trustfulness, and an openness to change. This isn't necessarily talking about the configuration of the self or how you reflect upon yourself. It's more a series of dispositions or personality traits. You have a sense of responsibility, trustfulness, and being openness to change. And this also leads to confidence and psychological well-being. So we find that your social class impacts your the occupational job that you hold. Occupational job, that's redundant. Your occupational position, and your occupational position in part determines your degree of being self-oriented, which has been found to have a direct impact on psychological well-being. We also find that a self-directed orientation leads to the ability to view issues from multiple perspectives, a personality characteristic called ideational or intellectual flexibility. So all this said, given the work experiences of the middle class versus the lower class, these psychological attributes are more common among the middle and upper class compared to the working class. So in this way, we can see the relation between um, macro, meso, and micro level structures, although in this study, the macro to meso level connection wasn't necessarily explicitly studied, right? They weren't studying how people, the process by which you move from being in a middle, so middle class environment and how that transition causes you to transition into a white collar professional job. This was more taken for granted as something that happens. You can see that there's actually a pattern in who gets into these various jobs, and that pattern has a social class element to it. But the process by which someone from the middle class is directed towards one type of job over another wasn't what was focused on. What was focused on is the elements of the context of these jobs and its relationship to personality outcomes. So let's go ahead and continue on with some work by Cohn and Schooler. So we also find that class differences in work experience also explain class differences in parenting style, right? So remember, there's many different proximate domains that SSP research might focus on, and often, well, not often, but sometimes the research makes explicit connections between these domains. So, what did Cohn and Schooler find? They found that personality characteristics cultivated by work environment affect how parents raise their children. Working class parents tend to value characteristics in their children that are consistent with success in blue collar jobs. So, this involves characteristics such as obedience and conformity. If your parent is working in a blue collar job where they aren't given much self direction, they have to follow a routine, they're not allowed to innovate, and they have someone closely monitoring them, then in their job, obedience and conformity will result in you continuing to have a job while questioning authority and deviating from routine may result in you being sanctioned. So, because this is the parent's experience in their workplace proximate context, this is something that they tend to value in their home life whenever it comes to their children, because even without meaning to, they're evaluating how successful their children would be in a work environment. And since they, the parent, work in a blue collar job, that's the reference they have for what their child's work environment might be like. Even though the child may grow up in such a way that they could seek a middle class job, the parent has direct experience with a working class proximate context in terms of occupation. And so that's the reference they use when raising their children and instilling various personality characteristics in them. So in this way, we see there's a relationship between proximate contexts, which themselves were a result of one's placement in a large system of stratification, the class system, and this relationship between two proximate contexts, between the work environment and the home environment, leads to the development of various personality characteristics in the children found in that home proximate context. Compare this with middle class parents who tend to value characteristics associated with success in professional white collar jobs. These characteristics involve things like curiosity and self control, because in your white collar type jobs, you're given more self direction. You have to hold yourself to task. No one's there constantly monitoring you, making sure you complete your job. It's expected of you to be innovative and find ways to go ahead and complete your task. And so, just like how the process worked for parents in blue collar jobs, the same sort of process plays out for parents in white collar jobs, but with a different effect because the difference in the proximate context, the work proximate context, middle class and lower class or working class parents experience. So, same process in that parents are bringing um, expectations and understandings from a proximate context in work, taking it home. This informs how they raise their children and the characteristics the children develop. But because there's differences in the work context, the children are raised with different value characteristics. So this isn't just some old research. This is a finding that's confirmed in modern research. It's been found using data from the 2016 General Social Survey, which we'll show in the next slide. And research has also found that this pattern can be generalized to other societies, including places like Poland and Japan, despite some notable differences in values across culture. Makes sense since we're talking about differences in these larger social structures in these nations and the cultural values of them. There will be some differences in the process, but the overall pattern of the process that there's this connection between workplace um, characteristics and norms and how parents raise their children still generally held. Japanese culture, for example, though, is more group oriented and places less value on individual achievement than US culture. So some of the elements within the proximate context may differ, but the idea still holds that the meanings and the expectations within your proximate context impact your personality and how you may act in other related proximate domains. And so here's that promised slide showing the data from the General Social Survey. We can see at the top, the question was, what is the most important characteristic for children? We have the characteristic obey, and we have the characteristic thinking for oneself, and then we have the numbers broken down in the first two columns as percentages. The final column is the total number of responses. So as we see for people who are non-professional or technicians, so we're going skipping the education, go down to occupation, right? We see that non-professional technician background individuals with a non-professional or technical occupation tend to go ahead and have the highest level of valuing the idea that children should obey whenever being told to do something. And as we move then to technical support or managerial professional, this percentage continues to drop. Same thing in terms of education level. The lower the education level, the more parents within that specific level are going to agree that children obeying is the most important characteristic for children. So we're finding both with education level and occupational status, there's this relationship between how likely you are to say children obeying is the most important characteristic that they can learn, which shows that this pattern doesn't just involve occupation, but involves other social structures that serve as systems of stratification that can impact what occupation you find yourself in, right? Like if you have lower educational credentials, you're less likely to find yourself in a managerial or professional position whenever you actually do join the workforce. Okay, let's move on to another set of studies. These are by Conter. So in her award-winning book, Men and Women of the Corporation, Conter draws attention how gender affects both personality and social mobility. So here we're talking about gender as a society-spanning system of stratification and how within a specific proximate context, the workplace, it has various personality outcomes. So the findings of Conter's study are the majority of clerical workers in the companies studied were women. These women exhibited traits commonly associated with femininity within the society. In particular, they wanted constant praise from their male bosses, and they regularly engaged in gossip. Now, Conter argues that these characteristics result from the occupation of low status jobs, proximate condition associated with women, rather than any innate tendencies of women. The argument is the patterns of behavior we're seeing here are in part based on personality, but these personality characteristics are not something innate to women as women. They are characteristics that are formed by the social structures, the proximate context that they find themselves nested within. Now, one step beyond this that wasn't directly studied in Conter's specific work here is the idea that your position within a gendered system of stratification is going to have an impact on what occupation you end up being filtered into. And then we see the process play out as Conter outlines here. But anyway, Conter argues the characteristics found in the women in her study were the result from the occupation that they held rather than any innate tendencies of women as women. So the argument is that people of low status tend to be insecure and require constant reassurance, When workers lack authority and resources within formal organizational structures, they seek informal avenues for securing power. And through gossip, people receive information they might not otherwise have had access to. And this information gives them a greater sense of control over their lives. So the argument is the conditions of their proximate environment and the occupation that they're in are what determine certain personality characteristics, which in turn explain behavior. We haven't necessarily examined, like I said in this study, the manner by which gender as a society spanning system of stratification impacts the occupation that you're in. But that is something that can also be studied and also has been studied in other research. So Conter argues ultimately that men are just as likely as women to exhibit praise addiction and engage in gossip when they experience low status and disempowering work conditions. The argument, going one step further, of course, is that men are less likely to find themselves in these lower status positions as a class. Remember, these studies aren't completely deterministic, right? They're probabilistic. They're not saying this will happen for every individual person. What they're saying is the average person in this group has this sort of likelihood of being in this situation relative to the average person in the other group. So how does this fit into the idea of social mobility? Focusing on issues related to social mobility, Conter offers a structural analysis of the psychological motivations beyond patterns of discrimination within the organization she studied. Very few women and racial and ethnic minorities made up the upper rungs of management within this company. And surprisingly, given this pattern, the white male managers who decided who did and did not get promoted did not exhibit negative attitudes towards women and minorities. So we find this interesting sort of pattern, right? We find that there are largely white men who are the managers in this organization, and as managers, they're the ones who largely determine who will be promoted within the company. Obviously, because the company has primarily white male managers, the women and the racial and ethnic minority members of that company were not getting promoted at the same rate as white males. However, the white male managers in the study didn't exhibit negative attitudes towards women and minorities. So the question becomes, why does this pattern exist if there doesn't seem to be any actual negative affect towards these individuals who are not white and male? Conter argues that uncertainty was at the root of their actions. Upper level managers' day to day work experiences were rife with uncertainty, and this was due to the lack of control they had over broad market forces, the substantial time lag between managerial decisions and their outcomes, and the hierarchical structure of the organization, such as multiple tiers of actors were required to put any managerial decision into effect. So, because there were so many aspects of their jobs they couldn't control, managers felt it was important to surround themselves with people they could trust to think and act like them. This meant promoting other white males from advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. Conter calls this process the homosexual reproduction of managerial ranks. What this is arguing is it is not necessarily a hatred or bias against the people who don't look like the managers. Rather, it is a bias towards people who look like them, because since these other people look like them, the white male managers feel more confident that they can understand the motivations and the backgrounds of these other white male employees. And because the white male managers are dealing with so much uncertainty as a structural component of their occupation, they're trying to minimize the total amount of unpredictability in their position. And one way to do this is to surround themselves with people like themselves who they feel they can trust and more easily predict what they're thinking and what they will do, right? So this results in a process that Contra calls the homosexual reproduction of the managerial ranks. It doesn't have to be due to malice, but that doesn't mean that the pattern doesn't exist, and that doesn't mean that the pattern doesn't have negative social consequences. It's very important to understand that in sociology, there can be negative patterns and negative consequences of these patterns without any malice existing. Oftentimes there is malice, but malice shouldn't be seen as requisite for a social problem or a problematic social structure to exist. That individualizes um, complex social problems in society, forcing everything to demonstrate an element of malice for it to be considered problematic or reproducing some form of inequality, and that's often not the case. So let's move on to another topic. Like we're going to be moving into another set of studies, but this topic is still related to the idea of researching the workplace as a proximate context, right? So let's talk about the concept of alienation within the context of SSP and work. So, what is alienation? Alienation refers to the separation of self and experience. This is actually a term that you find in a lot of earlier sociological research. We know that Marx talks about it whenever he talks about the worker being alienated from the fruits of their labor and the means and modes of production. I want to say Durkheim also talks about alienation to a degree. I think it was in his work whenever he was researching suicide. So this term has hung around for quite a while, and it's varied over the years and varies depending upon the specific focus of the sociologist and the theoretical paradigm that they're working within. So what does the book have to say in terms of its overall analysis of alienation within the context of social structure and personality? Says that alienation occurs when people lack control over their work and thus become estranged from the work process and from their basic human nature. Going back to that idea of, okay, so I'm in a white collar, I'm in a blue collar position. I'm not really given the freedom to innovate on the production process. I'm not given the freedom to say, well, maybe we should go ahead and and make this change to step 5 of the bag making process because it would be easier on the workers or it might be more efficient. The people in these positions are not given that element of self-directed agency. They're told that they have a very narrow range of tasks to do, that they're to do those tasks exactly as instructed, and that they'll be monitored to ensure compliance with that directive. So alienation occurs when people lack control over their work and become estranged from the work process and from what the book terms their basic human nature, which is a little bit problematic because then we never actually define what basic human nature is. So I would say it's easier to just limit the idea of alienation here, of becoming estranged from the work process, feeling like you don't have any input in the work process, that you're just a cog in the machine without any actual agency in the process. So this idea of alienation has been measured using survey questions focusing on things like the degree to which work is perceived as dull, perceived as unrewarding, and perceived as of little intrinsic value. It's also been measured as the degree to which people feel they lack control over their lives. So it's measuring, in short, this degree of feeling disconnected from the actual work that you're spending a large amount of your life doing. So if this is a factor impacting the lives of individuals and the work they do and their personality, which they take into subsequent situations. What predicts the degree of alienation that people feel? Factors that predict alienation include a sense that one's work is meaningless and that one has little or no autonomy. You're more likely to experience alienation if you don't have the ability to act agentically in your workplace. If you are basically forced to stick to a very specified routine without any opportunity to deviate without being sanctioned and you're constantly being monitored for deviation, you can be said to have little or no autonomy in your work. So individuals towards the bottom of a class hierarchy, people in working class jobs or the working poor, tend to have less autonomy at work and are therefore more likely to experience alienation. If you're coming from a background that doesn't have many resources, you're likely to find yourself in a job that doesn't really give you the opportunity to have for you to have any input on the actual job process itself. And this in turn is going to cause you to feel a greater degree of alienation towards your work than you likely would if you were in a different field of, a different line of occupation. So how does this then matter for subsequent behavior? Well, we find that workers experience Workers experiencing alienation are at risk for several factors, such as heavy drinking. Substance abuse may be one way to blunt the psychological consequences of a disempowering work environment. And this in turn can then feed into and reify an existing class structure because it's very hard to advocate for changing a class structure or even just changing your position in a class structure if you have become addicted to alcohol, because it's going to reduce your functioning and it's going to reduce your ability to um, dedicate resources, mental energy, emotional energy, time towards changing your occupational position. So let's move from talking about alienation specifically to talking a little bit more broadly about job satisfaction. So, what does job satisfaction matter in regards to SSP research? Job satisfaction is one of the potential positive outcomes related to job characteristics. So, just like alienation is in part an outcome of the characteristics of your job, so too is job satisfaction. So let's talk about job satisfaction now in the context of actual research. We have a comprehensive study of full-time workers, 8 years post high school, which found the following patterns. This research was conducted by Nguyen et al. In 2002. They found that autonomy or freedom at work is the strongest determinant of job satisfaction. So autonomy, which is going to determine alienation, or is, yeah, I guess it would be a determinant of how alienated you feel, also is the strongest determinant of this level of job satisfaction that you feel or don't feel. They found that race, but not gender, affects job satisfaction. In particular, Black employees are less satisfied with their jobs than white employees. So we find that within a proximate context, that the society-spanning system of stratification that is race, has an impact, although the manner by which it has an impact is not necessarily explored in this study. So in particular, Black employees are less satisfied with their jobs than their white counterparts. This in turn would then explain differences in various outcomes, although it isn't necessarily exploring how the society spanning system of equalities translates into these differences in proximate contexts. They also found that income is positively associated with job satisfaction and that this effect is stronger among males compared to females. This finding is consistent with prevailing societal expectations concerning work and gender. The idea that um, income is going to be associated with job satisfaction, but our society spanning system of meanings and expectations regarding gender place more emphasis on the amount of income you bring home relate how strongly the amount of income you bring home is related to your worth or your successful enactment of the man or male identity or the set of expectations ascribed to being a man compared to the set of expectations ascribed to being a woman. And so this finding is consistent with, like we said, prevailing societal expectations concerning work and gender, to where even now there's this general expectation that men are the breadwinners of a household. And so whenever men are more likely to have a stronger relationship between job satisfaction and income compared to women. Interestingly, we find that work hours are not associated with job satisfaction. If you don't like your job or you like your job, the amount of hours that you work at that job is not going to have an impact subsequently on how much you like or dislike that job. Um, it's things about the job itself and the properties of the work you do rather than how much work you're doing. And finally, the study finds that people are the most satisfied in professional jobs. This association persists even when the level of autonomy is held constant, indicating that these jobs have pleasing characteristics in addition to autonomy. And that's why it's difficult to study um, proximate context in SSP research, is because there are often many, many, many factors at play whenever it comes to proximate context. So does autonomy have an impact on job satisfaction, which in turn has various sorts of individual level outcomes? Yes. is autonomy the only thing that matters? No. We find that even whenever we hold autonomy constant, people are more satisfied in professional jobs, which means there are other structural components of these jobs besides autonomy that is causing them to be viewed as more, causing them to be viewed more favorably than how people view working class jobs with the roughly same level of autonomy. Here's a quick table, 4.3, occupations with the highest and lowest levels of job satisfaction. So our 10 most satisfying jobs are clergy, physical therapist, firefighter, education or administrator, painter, sculptor, and illustrator, teachers, authors, psychologists, special education teachers, and operating engineers. So you can see in many ways that these folks probably do have a bit more autonomy in their workplace. But consider these 10 most satisfying jobs and think to yourself, what else might be in play that could cause them to be viewed as more satisfying compared to, say, the least satisfying jobs? So, what besides autonomy could explain why these 10 things are so much more preferred or found to be so much more satisfying compared to the 10 least satisfying jobs, which were roofers, waiters, laborers, bartenders, packagers and hand packers, freight stock and material handlers, clothing salespersons, cashiers, food preppers, and expediters. Personally, I think one of the differences is you're going to have a lot more contact with the general public. I would imagine with less satisfying jobs than the more satisfying jobs, although maybe not. Maybe that's only for half of them, like bartenders, waiters, cashiers, food preppers. I know whenever I was working at McDonald's that having to interact with the public in that job was absolutely horrendous. In addition to it sucking that you couldn't really innovate when you're there. You just were on the line and you knew what you had to do, and there was no real innovation to how you did it. All right, moving on to another set of SSP research. And a set of proximate context that it focuses on. So let's talk now about SSP in schools and the Wisconsin model of status attainment. One moment, I need to grab something to sip on. All right, thank you for your patience. So, like I said, continuing on, let's talk about the Wisconsin model of status attainment. So the framing for this is that education has often been seen as a gateway to social mobility. By that I mean you find yourself in a different social class compared to the social class that you were born into. And education is often seen as one of the big determinants of your ability to change your class location within the system of stratification that is social class. Now, important to note, though, not everyone has equal access to education as a resource. So the Wisconsin model of status attainment identifies some of the social psychological processes through which social class influences educational and thereby occupational achievement. And as I've been kind of hinting at, this model focuses on explaining mobility, but specifically it's focusing on something known as intergenerational mobility. Intergenerational mobility. Intergenerational mobility refers to the location of an individual in the class structure relative to that of his, and we say his because most of these studies were done on men, on his parents. So you have intergenerational mobility if you end up occupying a social class location that is higher, or technically it could be lower than the position occupied by your parents. And so this model identifies both direct and indirect effects. What are direct and indirect effects? Direct effects are things that directly shape your location in a social class. Indirect effects don't shape your location in a social class on their own. Rather, indirect effects are things that shape something else, which itself affects your placement within social class. So a direct effect is evident when an independent variable influences a dependent variable directly. If it's done through a third variable, it's said to be an indirect effect. If I were to see if there's a relationship between, um, I'll just let the book go ahead and go with its examples versus me trying to throw out a million and one different examples from different studies. Um, so just continuing on. Most of the processes in this model also apply to females. However, due to patterns of race-based discrimination within schools and society, the model tends to fit the experiences of white individuals better than minority individuals. So the model, this explanatory model, tends to fit fairly well with men and women, but it typically fits better for white men and women compared to black men and women. So this is a visualization of the Wisconsin model of status attainment. If you don't have your screen pulled up, you'll want to right now, because this is where I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about indirect effects. This is actually a very interesting thing. We're bringing in structural equation modeling here, which is um, it's very interesting, very powerful, very advanced form of statistical analysis that allows us to examine things like indirect effects. So let's take a look at this idea of social class background here. This model says that your social class background will have a direct effect on your academic achievement. That is to say, there's a statistical relationship between the average person's social class background and the achievement that they have. It's likely that the higher your social class background, the greater your academic achievement, right? This model also proposes that there's a direct effect between social class background and educational attainment. Makes sense, right? Again, the higher your social class, if you're in the upper class or the middle class, you're more likely to have higher educational attainment. You're more likely to go to college or get a graduate degree than if you're from the working class or the working poor class. That's another direct effect. However, mathematically, we can also see whether social class background has an indirect effect on educational attainment through academic achievement. So what does this mean? This means that when we run our model, when we run all our math, we're seeing whether, one, academic achievement itself has an impact on educational attainment. That makes sense. The harder you work in school, the higher your educational attainment will be. If you're a really hardworking student, you're likely to then go on to college, and then you're likely to potentially go on and get a graduate degree. But after accounting for that, using our math, we can determine whether social class background, because of its effect on academic achievement, is having an effect on educational attainment, independent of the direct effect it has. And we do find that. We find that social class background doesn't just have a direct effect on educational attainment, but we find that it also affects educational attainment through its impact on academic achievement. Look at this model for half a second. Like, seriously, if you've only been listening up till now, like, stop and look at the model on the screen. This is why social psychology is so complex. Look at all those determining arrows. We have social class directly going to 1, 2, 3, 4 concepts. And of the concepts that it goes to, 3 of them go on to another concept. So social class impacts academic achievement, social influence, and education. And then we're finding that all 3 of these are proposed to have an impact on educational attainment. And we're finding that academic achievement and social influences also have an impact on educational aspirations, which we're predicting to have an impact on educational attainment. And while all this is going on, we have something on the same level as social class background, which is mental ability, doing the same thing. And we're estimating all of these statistical relationships at the same time while calculating both direct and indirect effects. This is very mathematically intense. Great thing is we have software that does this to where you could basically create a visual representation of the model you want to run like this, and then tell, so long as you have all of your data coded and everything has been, properly collected and coded in your statistics software, it can run the math for you and then spit out a series of results. This model right here represents, in a microcosm, the complexity of trying to understand the relationship between macro, meso, and microstructures within the context of social psychology. This is why you can have whole graduate courses on just specific facets of the social world because there's so much going on and there's so many ways that concepts can be interrelated with one another. Um, if you find this fascinating, I recommend reading the original article, or at least trying to find the original article. And then if you have questions or you want to talk about it, reach out to me and I'd be happy to go ahead and chat with you about this a little bit. Let's go ahead and move on from this visualization to talk about what the actual findings from this model were, because this is just a path model. This is what they were proposing the relationships would look like. This is before we actually statistically test to see whether those relationships actually exist. So what were the findings of this model? We found, or rather the authors found, that social class background, a components principle, influences level of education. It's done directly and indirectly through its effect on academic achievement, parental expectations, peer education plans, and discussions with teachers, which are all proximity principles, and finally, college aspirations, which are personality principles. Study also finds that social influences, your relationship with your parents, your peers, and your teachers, also affect educational attainment both directly and indirectly through their effect on student educational aspirations. So, components have an impact on your personality outcome, college aspiration, and your proximate principles also have an impact on this individual personality level outcome. The social psychological process in the middle of the figure, the intervening or mediating variable, explains much of the impact of class background on educational attainment. These relationships are important as education affects the type of jobs people get and how much they're paid. And so it's important to recognize that socialization within the family and at school is believed to be the explanatory process by which class affects the aspirations and subsequent educational and occupational outcomes of the individual, which is the psychology principle. So while we have components principles in play, a huge amount of what actually is determining the psychology principle here is the proximity principle. But we must remember that this proximity principle itself is greatly shaped by the components principles. And we must also recognize that while the components principles have the largest impact on the proximity principle, there are still effects from the components principles onto the ultimate, um, in this model, individual level outcomes, the psychology principle as it's framed within SSP. So, talking about schools, the relationship between schools, family socialization, various educational outcomes, let's talk about other social structures that are in play within the education system that can have an effect on subsequent personality and behavioral outcomes. So let's talk about the concept of tracking within schools. So within schools, there is a substantial amount of stratification. What do we mean by that? We mean there are inequalities in schools in terms of the level of training that individuals get, and this variation in the level of training is not random, but it largely is shaped or follows along the lines of existing axes of stratification within the larger society. For example, less advantaged students, people who in the class system of stratification are lower on the hierarchy, from low income areas tend to attend schools with the fewest economic resources and the lowest college placement rates. Your location within a proximate context is partially determined by a larger social structure, and the relationship between this larger social structure and your proximate context have a major impact on your developing personality and your subsequent behavioral outcomes. Now, with that said, this is kind of stratification between schools. Some schools are richer, some schools are poorer, but within schools, we also find substantial stratification. Within schools, tracking has been found to reflect a student's position within a larger society spanning system of stratification, and this in turn impacts their aspirations. Tracking is a proximity principle, it's impacted by a components principle, it has an impact on a psychology principle. Just to be clear, what is tracking? I didn't have tracking in my rural high school. There was no AP. You had college prep and you had basic, but these did not have any actual bearing on earning college credits. They didn't even affect your GPA. People who took basic English tend to have higher GPAs in my high school than people who took advanced English because an A is an A is an A. It doesn't matter if you got it in basic or quote unquote college prep. So while we had a limited degree of tracking, it's not as formalized as it is in many schools to where your placement in the more rigorous classes actually correlates with higher GPA and your ability to get into colleges and such. But what is tracking specifically within schools, regardless of whether it's a formal differentiation between basic and AP or whether it's just this uh, more informal classification of just how hard the teachers are going to work with you, right? Uh, from a rural high school, whether it's college prep or basic. In both these situations, we have tracking where students are placed into different classes or courses of study based upon their perceived ability. Um, it's the idea that you might have some level of say in whether you go into basic or AP English, but a big portion of which one you go into is going to be determined by the school. They're going to evaluate you onto what path they think you will be most successful in, then they will place you within that set of classes. Now, tracking usually involves ability grouping within elementary schools and sorting of students into vocational versus college prep tracks in middle and high school. So the idea is we see what your ability looks like in elementary school, and then we put you in one of two paths when you get to middle or high school to train you either in college prep or vocational training. Of course, as we already know, your placement within a larger system of stratification is going to have an impact on your ability within school. If you're from a upper middle class background at the elementary level, you're probably going to do better in school than someone who's from a working class or working poor class background. And so whenever you get to high school, because we're just viewing initial quote unquote ability in elementary school, we find that people from middle or upper middle class backgrounds tend to get sorted into college prep tracks. People from working or working poor classes tend to get put into vocational training, which means that once they graduate, people who were from a middle class background typically have been trained to then go on to find a middle class job. And by contrast, people who were from a poor or working poor class background tend to go into um, a blue collar job because they were given more vocational training in middle and high school. This is not meant to be malicious. At least on paper, it's not meant to be malicious. It's supposed to be a solution to a problem. On paper, it's supposed to tracking's believed to facilitate learning and is a way to increase student options in terms of course conduct. And it was assumed that early placement decisions are made based on valid assessments of student academic aptitude. The problem is, if you're not taking a broader view of social structure, you're not going to see how you're not accounting for existing social structures and how what you're doing is in fact reifying existing social structures because you're not taking into account the fact that students have different home lives And so the differences in aptitude you see in elementary school might not be a truly individual level difference or a purely individual level difference because it is in part shaped by larger um, proximate and component principles. So, unsurprisingly, research has found that class background is a primary determinant of track placement. Race ethnicity also influences the type of coursework students are exposed to, although much of this difference is due to the relationship between class and race. And that's one thing that really causes problems when studying social problems is there's a major overlay between race and class because of a series of historic social structures, right, that caused some racial groups to be more economically advantaged than others. And because there weren't concerted and continual devotion of resources, large amounts of resources to overcome this existing class inequality, it tends to just be reified over time. And so now we have this correlation between race and class location, but people tend to just ascribe all the difference to racial differences without realizing that there are structural elements that have caused race and class to become linked. And instead, we ascribe it to um, individual level differences or like this idea of like cultural level differences. Anyway, so getting into some subpoints that the book wants to highlight, researchers have questioned the validity of the measures of academic aptitude and IQ that placement tests are based on. For example, differences in vocabulary and intellectual flexibility rather than innate ability are the primary source of observed variation in test scores across social class. These are learned abilities linked to family experience. So, in elementary school, the vocabulary you bring to the table, your intellectual flexibility that you bring to the table, is in part a product of the family environment that you grew up in, which is in part determined by the class environment and the occupation that your parents are in. We already talked about that. If your parents are working class, they're going to go ahead and they're going to emphasize a different set of values and personality characteristics compared to parents in a middle class. And this in turn is going to shape the vocabulary and the skills and the personality dispositions, the characteristics that the child brings to school rather than there just being some innate difference in ability. The differences that we're seeing in children are largely determined by differences in family background experience. So children's college expectations are shaped within the family and coincide with parents' educational and work experiences, as well as with the expectations of teachers and parents. So what does this all lead to? It leads to tracking exacerbating class differences in educational attainment. And part of this is because students are aware of their track placement. They're not ignorant of what it means to be put in basic vocational English compared to college prep English. They know what they're being placed in. And those at the bottom of the stratification hierarchy often participate in peer subcultures that devalue education as a way to compensate for low status. If you've been placed into this low status group and you know others see you in this low status group, that is going to hurt your self esteem. Psychology, truly like psychological social psychology, demonstrates that we do a large number of things to prevent ourselves from experiencing harm. And having low self esteem is, in fact, a harmful experience. And so we engage in various processes to mitigate this harm. One of these processes that likely is to occur if your placement in a lower status is structural is to go ahead and develop a subculture that devalues education, basically saying, well, I've been placed in this situation, but I don't even really care. Like education doesn't really matter. And so being placed in that situation is subsequently not as harmful for your self-esteem, even though it does still result in you likely not having much social class mobility. I know it's a lot of depressing things whenever talking about SSP research, but it's good in a way to feel that way because it's a recognition that there are a large number of social structures impingent upon the developing life of an individual, even at their most early formative stages. and really emphasizes the need to consider not just the individual, but the totality of the individual's experience, which in many ways is shaped by the proximate component principles examined in SSP research. So let's shift again to another proximate domain, focusing or tied to another axis of stratification. Let's talk about SSP research in the family. Specifically, let's talk about gender and household division of labor. So, in her influential book, The Second Shift, Hochschild studied 50 working women with young children and their spouses in depth. I want to say these were a series of in depth interviews and participant observations, which is very interesting because that sounds more like symbolic interactionism, right, than social structure and personality. But it's really focused on the proximate conditions and their impact on personality development. And so, for that reason, um, the method that was chosen is, in my opinion, quite appropriate. So, what did Hochschild find? Uh, Hochschild found that in most families, women bear the burden of household tasks. As a result, these women are highly stressed. No matter how you want to measure it, whether it's amount of time, whether it's amount of effort, whether it's variety of tasks, whether it's number of tasks, women tend to do the majority of household labor. We find that even today. We find that even among young couples. We find that even among couples who want to have an equal distribution of labor. It rarely is 50-50 or the man doing more of the household labor on average, right? The primary reason for high levels of psychological distress among these women is role overload. So there is something structurally occurring. 'Cause we're not accepting that this is just something innate to human beings, because that's a pretty lazy explanation, at least if you haven't already examined social structure. You have to consider how social structure might be impinged upon this before you just rule that, well, this is a result of something innate to humans, this unequal distribution of labor. And so we have to consider, okay, why might these patterns exist? What structural factors may be in play that cause this pattern to arise in such a stable pattern over time and across situations? A big part of it is gender differences in meaning, but we'll get in that in the next slide. The thing this slide wants to emphasize to you is that this difference does exist and that this difference in um, proximate structure has an impact on individual level personality and outcomes. This unequal distribution of household labor typically results in elevated levels of psychological distress among women due to role overload. And as such, the relevance of the second shift in contemporary life has been called into question. So we find that men and women, on average, statistically, work about the same amount each week, about 65 hours per week, when both paid and unpaid domestic labor is taken into account, right? Data also suggests that men are doing more around the house than ever before. So it is important to recognize that this isn't near the inequality in the division of household labor is nowhere near as bad as it was in the 50s, but it's also still not equitable. Why is this mattering, though? Your compensation and recognition for the work that you do is not undifferentiated between household work and paid employment. So even though whenever you factor it all in together, that men and women do roughly the same amount of labor hours per week, whenever you consider both paid and unpaid work, paid work is likely to go ahead and result in you feeling better about yourself. And it's also likely to impact how you feel in the relationship because you're bringing resources to, like, tangible resources, and thereby a degree of power into the relationship with the money that you're bringing in. And if men and women aren't doing the same amount of work around the household, but they're totaling about the same amount of hours per week in terms of all labor performed, this means that women are likely doing are in spending more of their time of that 65 hours on unpaid labor, which doesn't have the same sort of benefits psychologically and structurally that paid labor does. So, second slide. Despite the fact that husbands are helping more, women typically still do. This is on average. Again, this is probabilistic, not deterministic. Finding a single exemption to this pattern does not invalidate this pattern, nor does this pattern say that this is exactly how you are. This is saying that on average, the average situation is like this. So on average, women do about twice as much housework and childcare as men. That's the pattern. So we find that there are differences in terms of the amount of labor, but we also find there's differences in the type of work that men and women do around the house. Men are more likely to do what's regarded as male activities, like fixing the car, taking care of the lawn. These are more intermittent, and they don't necessarily have fixed deadlines. And in my opinion, most importantly, they're not something that has to be done every day as daily maintenance. By contrast, tasks that women empirically have been shown to do more than men around the household are caring for children, running the household, things that you can't put off from one day to the next. Junior has to be fed every day. The lawn doesn't have to be mowed every day. And if women are doing the feeding while men are doing the mowing, she is now having a task burden every day that is drawing upon her resources. Whereas he can put the task off until it is opportune for him to do so, like to complete it within reasonable bounds, right? Like, don't go off on the idea that he can just put it off for months and months and months until he absolutely wants to do it. But it's not like he has to do it that particular day if he comes home from work and he's tired. If she comes home from work and she's tired and she's expected to go ahead and feed Junior, it doesn't matter how tired she is, she's still got to make dinner to feed Junior, right? Another point the book wants to raise is that the level of economic contribution from paid work influences the gender balance of household tasks. So, mothers who do most of the domestic labor work few hours outside the home than the father. It makes sense. If they're doing more domestic labor and yet both parties are doing around 65 hours of total labor each week, she's gonna have to find time in her schedule to, make up for that extra labor she's doing in terms of time commitment, and this often comes in the form of work hours, like formally paid work hours, right? So while work hours outside the home and earnings predict how much time women spend during housework during the week, these factors don't predict the amount of housework on the weekend. And so this is why we find that it's the weekends where women are most likely to do gender. So whenever men might take part of the weekend to rest, this is where women might spend additional hours cleaning the house because that is a task that through formal and informal negotiations within the relationship she is doing for one reason or another. This imbalance is going to have ripple effects. That's one of the biggest things that you study in social inequalities, right? Is that if there's a structural imbalance at one component of someone's life and social situation, it's going to ripple down towards later elements of their life and into other contexts of their life. So let's continue on with one more slide of this, and then we will go ahead and take a quick look at a chart from the book that helps demonstrate what we're talking about. So as women gain equality with men in the labor force, change in societal expectations concerning the distribution of domestic work are supposedly likely to follow. We have been seeing this gradually occurring, although it hasn't completely equalized the division of household labor. That's because this type of change tends to be gradual and typically occurs on a cohort basis. So what is a cohort? A cohort or an age cohort is a group of individuals born at a particular time who, as a result, share a common set of expectations. Ugh. It's the idea that you were all born into a similar society spanning system of stratification in a particular configuration. And so you will probably have similar outcomes and similar relations with the social structure. And we find that the differences in the distribution of household labor don't occur necessarily from at the individual age level between someone who's 42 and 41 or 40 and 39. They occur between these age cohorts of, say, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, right? So shifts in attitude over time take place as one age cohort dies out and is replaced by a new generation of individuals who, because of the conditions that they were born and raised in, are socialized in different structural contexts. For example, baby busters, individuals born from 65 to 81, are more likely to believe that parents should share childcare responsibilities equally compared to baby boomers, people born in 46 to 64. Uh, we also find that those born after 1980, people who are considered millennials, tend to reject traditional gender roles to a greater degree on average. Does this mean millennials overall reject all gender roles? No, absolutely not. But it is markedly different compared to the age cohort that preceded them. So let's take a look at a chart. Figure 4.4 in your book, changes in gender role attitudes. And here's another thing that's really important to understand, real damn important, all right? Attitudes are not perfect predictors of behavior. That's one of the most important things that we find in these studies, right? This was one of the things I did a good bit of looking into whenever I was in grad school. Um, Over time, we definitely do see these changes in general attitudes. So whenever it comes to household division of labor, younger cohorts, newer cohorts are more likely to have attitudes that they want to have an equal distribution of labor. But this doesn't mean that their behavior is an actual equal distribution of labor. It might have behaviors that are more equally distributed, but wanting to have an equal distribution of labor or having an attitude that favors an equal distribution of labor does not perfectly translate into behavior. Just because you think or want something does not mean that is how you will behave. That would, in effect, be denying the direct effect components or macrostructures have, and even mesostructures have, on the way you behave in a given situation. But if we look at our chart here, blue line, men work, these are beliefs. Blue line represents people thinking men work better at home, men work better, women should be around the home. The orange line is for people who view working mothers harming children, and the gray line is people who think that preschool children suffer when a mother works. So basically, these are three indicators of people's attitudes towards gender role division whenever it comes to household labor. Blue being that men are supposed to be at work, women at the home. Orange being that being a working mother harms children, and gray representing the idea that preschool children suffer when a mother works. In the late 70s, orange line is at 50%. The blue and gray line are each somewhere between 65 and 70%. Fast forward that to 2016, we find all of these measures hovering just between 20 and 30%. So about 25% of folks agree with these sentiments, which means one, there's still a large existing set of attitudes regarding the division of labor that favors an unequal distribution of labor. But it is important to note that at least the attitude regarding this, that there should be this division of labor, this unequal division of labor within the household, is no longer in the majority, at least as measured in the general social survey. So attitudes change. Attitudes do have an impact on behavior, but it's important to recognize that attitudes change more readily than behaviors change. Attitudes don't necessarily involve a direct change in behavior commensurate with the change in attitude we see over time. All right, one final point, and then we're getting to our summary slides for this chapter. So we've been talking about a variety of different domains within life. We've talked about work, we've talked about the family, we've talked about education, we've talked about these things interacting with each other, and we've talked about the fact that they're related to these larger social structures like gender, race, and class. Now let's take a little bit of a longer view, something called life course research. What is life course research? It's a subfield within SSP research. This thing called life course research. Life course researchers study the social experiences and attitudes of cohorts such as baby boomers or millennials, and they study intra-generational changes in role expectations and their psychological consequences. They're interested in the role transitions and variations in social relationships across the age spectrum. How do your roles and views and attitudes and behaviors change as you move through your life course from being a teenager, young adult, middle adult, older adult, retired, elderly, right? This life course research focuses on the family as a proximate environment, and it links age related life experiences to psychological outcomes. For example, Morawski and Ross 2010 showed that middle aged individuals have the lowest levels of depression. They attribute this to things like marriage, stable working lives, economic well being of the individuals in this age range. There are whole courses on life course research that we unfortunately just do not have time to get into here in chapter 4. But it is good to at least acknowledge that this vein of research exists within SSP because it is a very prominent field of research. But its principles and the things it studies, such as milestones and all these other not micro, but these very specific concepts, we just don't have time to get into here today. So let's round out. How do we evaluate SSP research? Book wants to highlight a couple of strengths and a couple of limitations of SSP research. What are the strengths? Strength of SSP research is its emphasis on the social processes that link macro level structures, status characteristics, and roles to micro level perceptions, feelings, and behaviors. Second strength the book wants to highlight is that studies within SSP tend to be survey based and thus yield findings that are generalizable. The breadth of the research generated by this perspective is also a strength, and the research generated often has policy implications that have the potential to affect changes on a wide scale. So, what are the limitations then of SSP? SSP research has been criticized often by traditional SI research for overemphasizing general patterns and overlooking many of the social nuances to social life. There's a general tendency within SSP research to overlook the reciprocal nature between individuals and society. SSP research really doesn't look at how these individual outcomes then in turn replicate large systems of stratification. And those working within the SSP phase have critiqued the lack of attention given to making clear how social structure affects personality. So the fact that it's looking so much at this proximity principle that it actually is neglecting the relationship between social structure and the psychology principle. Okay, final slide, integrating perspectives. Psychological theories have provided researchers with some of the concepts needed to develop more complete models of the link between social structure and psychological states, the psychological principle. For example, there's a growing literature on social cognition that emphasizes the relationship between current social arrangements, in particular racial inequality, and the cognitive structures or schemas that enable people to process the information they encounter. Cognitive schemas are, by the way, mental representations containing information about objects, people, and events. By this, we mean they're generalizations based on the sum total of people's past experiences, and they have organizational structures that affect how information is processed and stored. And with that, everyone, thank you for watching our second lecture on Chapter 4. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer your questions. And thank you very much for your time.